You are listening to The Moon Mother, Pemberton Manor, Book 2, written and narrated by Becky Doughty. Chapter 1. Lucy covered her face with both hands, pressing her cold fingertips to the hollows below her eyebrows. The phone on the bed beside her vibrated repeatedly against her thigh, and she held her breath until the buzzing stilled. She willed the child on her other side to stay sleeping. "Don't wake up, Itsy baby. Don't wake up." He'd found her. At least that's what he said in his text and phone messages. Of course, he still had her number. She couldn't afford to get a new phone right now, and she was too afraid to get rid of the one she had until it could be replaced. Especially not with a baby due in less than a month. Besides, after what he'd done, she really hadn't expected him to come looking for her. He could be lying. Why would he tell her and give her the chance to run again? Why didn't he just show up like he kept threatening to do? But then, he liked to keep her guessing, keep her glancing over her shoulder, off balance. Somewhere in the building, someone played a ukulele, the lovely lilting song a gentle mockery of the heaviness in her chest. She tried to visualize swaying palm trees and sandy beaches, the rhythmic lapping of waves on the shore, building, tumbling, crashing, dragging her under into shark-infested waters. Now she sounded like Grace Winters, her new friend who imagined worst-case scenarios ending in dismemberment or death at every turn. Grace and Sarah Winters. What a difference those sisters had made in the few short weeks since they'd met. Sarah, a first-grade teacher who lived in the only other apartment on the third floor, regularly stopped by throughout the week, bringing fun activities and crafts to entertain Itsy. She also brought with her various home-cooked treats. Sarah loved to bake, and at least once a week, a full meal, usually on Monday afternoons. She insisted it was extra food from their family Sunday dinners at the folks' house the next town over, but what she brought always seemed to be whole meals, ready to heat and eat, not leftovers smashed into plastic containers. Sarah repeatedly extended an invitation for her and Itsy to join the family each week, but Lucy turned her down every time, knowing that the invitation was more out of pity than anything else. And although it was almost painful for Lucy to accept the free food, she and Itsy could usually make those meals last a few days if they were careful. She lowered her hands to trace the lunar curve of her bulging belly and stared up at the elaborate light fixture that graced the ceiling over the bed. It looked a couple of 100 years old, but it was most likely a replica, something stocked on the shelves of the local home improvement store. Everything about the place, from the heavily scrolled trim around the doors and windows, the high ceilings elevated by ornate crown molding, wood-paneled walls painted pleasant earth tones, gave off the aura of ageless grace, of timelessness. Although her studio apartment was sparsely furnished with her meager belongings, Lucy could imagine the room decorated with those very British fox hunt paintings or somber portraits in gilded frames, maybe a couple of overstuffed stiff-back reading chairs, and a fainting couch or gossip bench. At least one wall would be lined floor to ceiling with shelves of books, and heavy drapes would hang at the 2 large windows, drawn open with tasseled tiebacks. Even the floors were real wood beneath the dark green carpet that she and Itsy pretended was the forest floor when they played magical wood nymphs. Sean had warned her about them the day she moved in. "Don't forget you live on the 3rd floor, dude. The guy in the apartment below you, Paxton, he's all right. Not a complainer or anything, but if you have any wild times up here, he'll definitely know. And then you'll know that old Pax knows, and that can get awkward, yeah?" He eyed her belly pointedly, one side of his mouth quirked up in what she could only call a congratulatory grin. Lucy laughed and patted her stomach. I think your Mr. Paxton can rest easy. I've had about all the wild times I can handle for a while. Sean Canseco, Lucy had discovered quickly, was as transparent and forthright as a teenage boy. He liked parties, girls with big boobs. Lucy couldn't remember how that subject had come up, but the way he'd said it made her laugh, even though she'd casually crossed her arms over her own pregnancy hormone-enlarged bosom. He drove a beat-up Chevelle he planned to restore someday, and his favorite movies were the Jason Bourne series. He did surprise her, however, when he'd said, "But I like the books better, yeah? Even though the original author is 6 feet under, and that Van Lustbader guy, dude," he interrupted himself, "that name is awesome. He's writing the newer books, you know, but I think the integrity of the Bourne character is still totally preserved within the franchise, yeah?" He'd waited for her to nod, and then added, "I have them all, so if you ever need to borrow one, just give me a shout-out." Lucy had read the first book in the series years ago. It was highly entertaining, certainly, but also written for readers who had more than a few intact brain cells functioning at slightly elevated levels of comprehension. Who knew Sean had it in him? "I like to jump on the bed sometimes," Itzy had piped up, grinning up at Sean. "Is that wild times?" Sean held up a hand for a high five. "Totally wild, kid. You ever read Where the Wild Things Are?" "Let the wild rumpus start," Itzy declared, her imaginary scepter held aloft. And the two of them had careened around the room a few times, whooping and yipping like wild beasts, making Lucy laugh out loud, something she hadn't done in a while. She'd fallen in love with Pemberton Manor the moment Sean had ushered her through the rather pretentious front door of the building. Set back from the street, the blocky structure with its pillared front entrance reminded her of the country estate Cinderella might have lived in before she married the handsome prince and moved to the palace. The expansive front yard was encircled by an iron fence with sturdy brick posts every 8 or 10 feet apart. Neatly trimmed hedges and flower beds were kept in check by a weekly lawn maintenance crew, and a gigantic 3-tiered fountain gurgled pleasant salutations to residents and guests who came and went. Itzy couldn't resist dipping her fingers in the water every time they passed it, and Lucy too had succumbed to the urge a time or two. Although she recognized many of the plants in the borders and beds as low-maintenance, drought-tolerant species native to the area, the house and property somehow looked to her like it had been plucked out of an English landscape and deposited in the middle of their Southern California neighborhood. When she'd said so, Sean had held up a hand for Lucy to high-five this time. Astute! He explained the place was a replica of another Pemberton Manor, the family home of the property owners who had, indeed, originated someplace in northern England. Maybe the Yorkshire Dales, yeah? You ever read James Herriot? He was a vet in that part of England, and his animal stories are awesome. Lucy had nodded, once again surprised by Sean's literary scope. He'd grinned at Itzy and mussed her hair with a quick gesture. "You like animals, right?" Without waiting for the child's answer, he said, "You'd totally like his books, kid. Have your mom read them to you." Sean Canseco was a nephew to the property owner, or maybe a second cousin by marriage or some such thing. And Lucy was pretty sure his familial connection was what had landed him the job of property manager at Pemberton Manor Apartments. It certainly wasn't his maintenance skills, or his availability when maintenance skills might be required. But although Sean had been remiss in his managerial duties on multiple occasions in the couple of months since she'd moved in, he'd been unforgettably kind to her and Itzy the day they'd come to check out the apartment. He'd looked her in the eye without censure when she'd said it would just be the 2, soon to be 3 of them, moving in, accepting and welcoming her without reservation. And Itzy had taken to him immediately. On moving day, he'd met her out front with the keys, and then generously offered his help moving her things in. Lucy had been so surprised by his offer that she'd agreed. She was usually more wary of accepting help. In her experience, a guy's offer of assistance often came with strings attached. Sean had spent the next hour helping her empty out the tiny U-Haul trailer she'd rented. She didn't have many belongings, just a second-hand overstuffed chair that she and Itzy read in together, a coffee table she'd painted bright teal where they shared meals sitting cross-legged on the floor, and a futon couch that doubled as the bed Lucy and Itzy shared. She also brought with her the diminutive writing desk where Lucy spent much of her time working each day. It had taken the three of them several trips up and down in the old Otis elevator, and Sean had endeared himself to her even more by patiently instructing Itzy on how to safely operate the old clunker. The child loved riding in the thing, and even though Lucy hated small spaces, she loved that Itzy was finding reasons to smile again, so she put her childbirth breathing exercises to good use. Truth be told, Sean had been a godsend. Moving out of the ground-floor apartment they'd lived in the past few years had been difficult enough, but getting everything they owned up to the third floor of Pemberton Manor was likely more than she'd have been able to handle with only Itzy's help. She knew that, out of sheer desperation, she'd have figured out a way, even if it killed her, but she was immeasurably grateful for Sean's assistance. With trepidation, at the end of the day she'd asked, "How much do I owe you for your help, Sean? I don't have much, but I'm willing to pay you something for your time." She wasn't going to leave the terms of the offer open-ended. She wasn't offering to trade services of any kind. "Dude, I don't need your money." He'd acted genuinely surprised by her question, but then he must have seen something in her eyes because he added, "Seriously, Lucy, I had the free time, so I offered. No strings attached, yeah?" Hearing those particular words coming unprompted from him had made her almost weep with relief. Then he'd shrugged a little sheepishly and shoved his hands in his pockets. "Actually, if you could make sure and pay your rent every month on time, yeah, that would be awesome. I kinda let a few things slide on your application. See, I sorta let this apartment stay empty too long, and now my uncle is busting my butt to get it filled, like last month already, so don't make me regret it, yeah?" She'd wanted to weep and hug him. Instead, she invited him to join them for cheap pizza and cheesy breadsticks, a treat she'd already promised Itzy to celebrate their move. That had been Thanksgiving weekend, and Sean had become like an irritating, albeit lovable, kid brother, stopping in unannounced, sometimes just to say hi, and other times to bring books for her and Itzy. He'd even stopped by a few times with fast food kid meals. The toys are always awesome in December, for Itzy and him, and chicken wraps for Lucy. "I figured you'd want something healthy for the baby and all," he'd explained. And Lucy didn't have the heart to tell him that healthy fast food was pretty much an oxymoron. Chapter 2. A soft knock on the door made Lucy start in surprise, and a breathy squeak escaped her before she clapped a hand over her mouth. A quick glance at Itzy assured her the child still slept. Hard in her throat, she eased herself off the futon and crept across the room to the door, dialing 911 and poising her thumb over the send button, just in case. Through the peephole, she saw it was only Sean. She took a slow, deep, cleansing breath, licked her suddenly dry lips, and opened the door. "Hey, Sean, what's up?" She spoke in a near whisper, hoping he'd pick up on the cue to keep things at a dull roar. Instead of charging in like a boisterous kid the way he usually did, He just stood there, tugging at the hem of his shirt, not quite meeting her gaze. "What's wrong?" Lucy asked, her pulse leaping again. Luce," he began, then cleared his throat and started again. So is Itzy here?" Lucy knew he could see past her into the studio apartment to where Itzy curled into a ball on the futon behind her, surrounded by the books they'd been reading. "She's asleep." "Oh, okay, good." "What is it, Sean? What's going on?" Her mind raced with all the possibilities, but she came up empty. "So, remember I told you about Pax downstairs? The guy below you?" Lucy nodded, but said nothing, waiting. "So, yeah. Well, he said things sounded like they were getting a little out of hand up here tonight." Sean pursed his lips and lifted his eyes to hers, finally. They were shadowed with questions, with uncertainty. "Dude, is everything okay? Is Itzy all right?" Lucy stepped out into the hall and pulled the door almost closed behind her. "What do you mean?" Clearly there'd been some kind of misunderstanding. Other than the disruptive phone messages, the evening had been as uneventful as every other. A quiet dinner followed by an episode of Itzy's favorite kids show, and then Lucy had bathed her daughter, read to her, and put her to bed. "She's fine. Everything is fine, Sean. What is Paxton talking about?" "Oh, well, he said he heard yelling up here, like a guy yelling. Maybe some crying, too?" Even though it was a statement, his voice lifted at the end like he was asking her to confirm or deny it. When she did neither, he continued. "He thought maybe someone was, getting hurt or something." He stuttered and stammered over the words, as though he knew they didn't make sense, but he was obligated to say them anyway. "He was really concerned, you know? I mean, like, ready to call the cops concerned." Lucy shook her head, hating the images his words were conjuring up. "Sean, it's been totally quiet up here. There isn't anyone else but Itzy and me." She pushed open the door again and waved an arm inside. "See for yourself." "But—" He paused, and then took a deep breath. She thought he looked relieved, however, the puzzled expression on his face still lingered. "Doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than to Lucy. "Pax is pretty worked up, yeah? I mean, I just left his place." "There's no one here but us," she said again, stepping back to let him in. "Come in, Sean, please." Lucy didn't like the look on his face. "I'm just getting ready to make some tea. Would you like a cup?" She didn't know what else to do to put his mind at ease. Sean sidled past her, clearly still hesitant. His gaze scanned the room, and he shook his head. "Nah, I'm good." Lucy busied herself filling the kettle with water and then set it on a back burner to boil. Could it have come from outside his window, or someone's television in another apartment? Sean leaned back against the counter nearby, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He shook his head, his brow furrowed. "Nah, old Pax wouldn't make that kind of mistake. He's not one to stir things up for no reason." "Well, what exactly did he hear? Did he tell you?" She didn't look at him, partly in an effort to build a protective wall around her heart, but also to try to put him a little more at ease. She scooped loose tea leaves into an infuser, and then reached up to take a mug from the cupboard. She'd never seen Sean this flustered before. "According to Pax," he said after clearing his throat loudly, "some ugly name-calling, and he thought he heard the guy yell something like, 'You owe me,' and 'You can't hide.'" Sean darted a glance at Itzy. In a softer voice he said, "Threatening stuff, yeah?" The mug slipped from Lucy's hand and clattered into the sink, the handle snapping off on impact. Her fingers shook as she snatched the broken piece out of the sink, and set them on the counter. She couldn't seem to catch her breath, or at least not one deep enough to rid herself of the buzzing in her ears. Sean straightened and started toward her, but stopped when he saw her expression. She stared at him, her eyes wide. She couldn't squeeze any words past the tightness in her throat. "You okay?" he asked, reaching out a hand, but not actually touching her. Lucy nodded and swallowed hard, willing herself not to gag on the fear that rose up at the back of her throat. How was it possible? "Are you sure? Is he sure?" she stammered. Sean shoved his hands in his pockets again, but didn't step away. "Yeah." Lucy waited, her breathing shallow. She could tell there was more. "He heard it off and on all last night, too. That's why he said anything at all. He doesn't sleep well, yeah?" Lucy covered her mouth, her fingers cold and trembling against her lips. She'd received the first message from Richard right before dinner last night, and they'd kept coming, long into the wee morning hours. He'd taken a break, probably to get some sleep, and they'd started up again around noon. She knew she was going down, but there was nothing she could do to stop herself. Her knees buckled, and she sagged against the cabinet and slid to the floor. Sean leapt forward and caught her around the shoulders before she hit the ground, slowing her enough so she didn't land hard. "Whoa," he muttered. "Dude, you okay?" Lucy wrapped her arms under her belly, cradling her unborn child instinctively as she leaned forward and tried not to give in to the sinking sensation that threatened to overwhelm her. I need a minute," she gasped. "Breathe in. Hold 1, 2, 3. Breathe out. Hold 1, 2, 3. Repeat." "Want me to help you to your chair?" Sean asked, once Lucy's breathing had slowed a little. Her hands were damp. She could feel the moisture through the fabric of her t-shirt. Her left ankle was bent at an awkward angle beneath her, cutting off the blood circulation. If she didn't shift soon, her foot would fall asleep. "Please," she murmured. Her voice came out breathy, so she reiterated, "Yes, thank you." Once she was safely in the armchair, Sean filled a glass with tap water and brought it to her, and then lowered himself to the floor close enough that they could talk in low voices so as not to wake Itzy. "What's going on, Lucy?" he asked, sounding much more like a man than he ever had to her before. Are you in trouble?" Lucy took several long sips of the water, swallowing the cool liquid past the lump still lodged in her throat. She didn't look at him for several moments, her eyes instead resting on Itzy where she slept, oblivious to the turmoil going on in her mother's mind. Could she tell Sean about Richard Spencer? Could she trust him? Should she trust him? Would he even believe her? She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. How could she explain that the very words heard by the man in the apartment below hers were the exact same words she'd received by voicemail and text again and again over the last 24 hours? Lucy pressed her lips together decisively. I think I'll be okay," she said, finally getting her spinning thoughts under control. "I'm not sure what he heard, but it wasn't coming from my place. Maybe Mr. Paxton's window was open, and he heard someone arguing outside." She knew it was a ridiculous suggestion even before Sean shook his head. She hurried on, not giving him the chance to speak. "I'm sorry about that in there. I need to eat something. I've been really lightheaded all day, and I should have stopped earlier." She gestured at the writing desk where her laptop was plugged in, the screen open but dark. "Sometimes I get working and just forget to eat." Sean glanced over his shoulder at her kitchen, at the 2 plates, the 2 forks, and the 2 glasses in the drainer in the sink. Evidence to the contrary, that she and Itzy had, in fact, recently eaten. Doubt shadowed his features, but he said nothing. "And then, if I stand up too quickly," she added, doggedly pressing on, willing him to believe her anyway. She shrugged one shoulder and took another sip of the cold water, not bothering to finish her statement. Sean's gaze drifted around the room again, his eyes narrowed the tiniest bit, brows furrowed. Lucy knew he didn't really believe her, but other than the dinner dishes in the drainer, nothing looked amiss, and there certainly was no indication that the apartment might have been the scene of domestic violence in the recent past. "What are you working on?" he asked, his voice low, hesitant. Once again, he wasn't looking directly at her. He knew? Oh no, please. Did he know? But she didn't miss the flush creeping up his neck, the way he scratched at his jawline, how his attention went back to the laptop and stayed there. "I'm just finishing up some promotional posts for a couple of clients." He knew she worked as a virtual assistant, at least that's what her rental application stated, and she did. But she was also the author of a popular erotica series she'd written and independently published under the pseudonym Delilah Violet. Delilah Violet wasn't on the application. It was, in fact, her Delilah Violet success that paved the way for Lucy Farnsworth to become a virtual assistant for other authors. Her venture into the intricacies of independent publishing gave her all the hands-on skill she needed to assist authors who opted to turn over the non-writing elements of their careers to people like Lucy. Things like formatting and design, marketing and promoting, maintaining social media sites, bookkeeping, and more. Delilah Violet had personally referred Lucy to several other authors, and much to her relief, her clientele list was growing, as was her reputation for doing excellent work. Her VA work still didn't pay enough to live on, not like her Delilah Violet books, but she finally had what she needed in her secret savings account to get into her own place and out from under Richard's heavy hand. If she was careful, she would have enough left in her savings after the move to cover her living expenses until the VA income reached the next level. Even with a new baby, she'd work her fingers to the bone to make it happen, because Lucy Farnsworth was beyond ready to put Ms. Violet and all her dirty stories into retirement and leave them behind for good. For her to leave Richard Spencer behind for good, too. She'd officially pulled the complete series the week of Thanksgiving, the same week Richard had discovered her secret savings account. She'd been extremely thankful to be done with everything Delilah Violet. Richard, not so much. Not only was he enraged over her holding out on him, both financially and apparently in the bedroom as well, according to his furious rantings, and he wasn't about to let her retire her pen name. She owed him. She'd barely gotten out of there with her life, and since that day, there had been too many times to count when she'd almost buckled and brought Delilah Violet back. The hospital bill she'd incurred from being shoved against the wall a little too roughly at 6 months pregnant, and the shocking absence of funds in her savings account after Richard put to use the password that he'd forced out of her, and the frighteningly bare cupboards in her tiny kitchenette and mini fridge. The whole situation threatened to crush her on a daily basis, but she'd held her ground. She was weary of the dark places she'd gone while writing the stories, disenchanted by the demoralization of sex, and even worse, of love. Lucy knew what she was writing was not love, was not really even passion, but purely carnal desire, and even though she knew she was good at putting stimulating words together, for the sake of her own spirit, she needed to be done. Her stomach twisted at the thought of little Itzy ever reading the things she'd written, and possibly thinking for even one moment that Lucy condoned the way her characters treated each other. Lucy knew what came of that lifestyle firsthand, and she wanted Itzy and this new baby as far away from it as she could possibly keep them, no matter how Richard ranted and raged. And oh, how he'd raged. Lucy had never been so frightened in her life. Itzy had hidden in the closet under her snow-white blanket, not making a peep, just as she'd been told, and Lucy had taken the brunt of Richard's attack without a peep either, until she'd hit the wall and come to some time later, the apartment around her eerily quiet, except for the whimpering sounds coming from between her bloodied lips. "Is someone stalking you?" Sean asked, his voice just the slightest bit strained, and she couldn't tell if he was nervous or aroused. If he'd read any of Delilah Violet's books? Please, God, no. Lucy took a deep breath and pushed to her feet. As comfortable as she'd become with Sean, she really didn't know him, or what he was capable of, and a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that he'd done an awful lot for her over the last couple of months. Regardless of what he'd said, perhaps he thought she owed him after all. And like so many of the girls Delilah Violet wrote about, Lucy felt the doubt creeping in, heard the voice in her head questioning if perhaps, just maybe, Lucy did owe him something, just as she'd believed she'd owed Richard. A metallic taste in her mouth made her gag reflex start and stutter. She'd bitten the inside of her cheek hard enough to draw blood, and she clamped her lips shut and moved around Sean into the galley kitchen. She quickly perused the small space for a ready weapon should she need one. Her eyes alighted on a sharp paring knife in the drainer, one she'd used to cut up an apple, a pear, and a banana for their fruit salad she'd served with their spaghetti meal. "I'm fine, Sean. I'm going to eat something and call it a night, okay? Thanks for checking on me." She began putting the few dishes away in the cupboard, all but the black plastic-handled knife that rested tipped down in the utensil caddy. "Please take the hint, Sean. Please." He stood, and for a moment he hesitated as though he wasn't going to leave. Then, with a small noise in the back of his throat, he turned toward the door. "Look, just call me if you have any trouble, Lucy. I mean it. Pemberton Manor is a safe place. Any trouble, okay?" She nodded, but said nothing, and he left without pressing her for more. Chapter 3. Lucy slid to the floor again, not trusting her legs to support her the short distance back to the chair. Her whole body trembled. What on earth had just happened? How? How had Mr. Paxton heard the words Richard was sending her? It wasn't like she'd read them out loud or anything. And even if she had, there was no way on earth her voice would ever be mistaken for an angry man's. "It's not possible," she muttered. "It's just not possible." "Mommy?" Itzy's tiny voice rose above the clamor of thoughts in her mind. Like she'd flipped a switch, Lucy's demeanor went from despair to delight, even if it was more an act of will than anything. She was determined to leave the past in the past and give Itzy and the new baby, Oliver, a life filled with good things, unmarred by the ugliness of fear and violence. "Hey, baby," she murmured, not getting up, not yet trusting her knees not to shake. "Why are you sad?" the child asked. Itzy didn't look fully awake. She hadn't lifted her head from the pillow. Lucy hoped to set her mind at ease, so she'd fall back to sleep quickly. "I dropped my tree mug and the handle broke off." "Oh," Itzy said in a sigh. "I'm sorry, Mommy. Was Sean here?" "Yes, sweetie pie. He stopped by to check on us, but when he saw you were sleeping, he said he'd come back later. Sorry if we woke you up." "It's okay." Itsy yawned, her mouth opening wide, and a little squeak slipped out. She giggled and closed her eyes again, tucking the head of the worn and nubby Tiggy-Wiggy under her chin. Itsy hadn't been able to say Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle when she'd received the stuffed Beatrix Potter hedgehog from her grandparents a few Christmases ago. The child snuggled deeper into her blankets and sighed sweetly. It was the best sound in the world to Lucy, made more so by the fact that her daughter had only begun to do it since moving here to Pemberton Manor. More specifically, since Christmas, when they'd gotten stuck in the building's ancient Otis elevator with Grace Winters and August Jones, and had met Grace's sister Sarah, who lived in the apartment next door. Sarah had quickly become Itzy's favorite neighbor, and Grace, Itsy called her Gracie just like Sarah did, also made a point to stop by for a visit every time she came to see her sister. Although they hadn't seen August Jones since the day in the elevator, Lucy hadn't missed the almost palpable connection between him and Grace. It wasn't her place to ask, but she hoped they were discovering their happily ever after together. The tea kettle began its crescendo whistle, and Lucy shoved quickly to her feet and snatched it from the burner. She shot an apologetic look at Itsy, who just smiled, but didn't open her eyes. This was how it was supposed to be, all the time. That healthy glow on her daughter's cheeks, the rosebud lips lifted in peaceful slumber, safe in the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who loved her. People who may even like Lucy, too, if she could just let down her guard a little and accept the friendship being offered. But what if Richard showed up here? What if he stirred up trouble? Could he force her to come back to him? He was the father of her unborn baby, after all. Did he really think she would, even after everything that had happened? When she'd come to and found him gone, she'd been so relieved she'd barely felt her pain. At least not right at first. Within a few hours, though, her back hurt so badly she thought labor was imminent. Even now, nearly 3 months later, if she sat for too long or bent a certain way, she'd be miserable for hours. The doctor told her the fall had actually fractured her tailbone. Not only would it likely take months to completely heal, but it might get worse again when she gave birth. She wasn't looking forward to that. But every time her back hurt, it bolstered her resolve to not go back. Not to Richard, not to Ms. Delilah Violet. But Richard was looking for her, demanding that she come back to him, her and Delilah Violet both. Lucy needed him, he said, especially with the new baby on the way. He had it wrong, though. It may have taken crashing into a brick, in her case plaster, wall to knock some sense into her, but she knew without a doubt that she no longer needed him. Maybe she never had. Richard Spencer, however, needed her, and Delilah Violet's royalties. She had no doubt the money he'd stolen from her was already gone, her escape money, that a lack of funds was what had him sniffing and snarling around her door after his 2.5-month silence. He didn't know she'd been to the doctor and had a medical report of her scrapes, bruises, and fractures, and not just from the most recent visit. The X-rays had revealed other hairline fractures, too, injuries Lucy had borne for the sake of her debilitating fear for Itzy's safety, should anyone try to interfere in the name of protecting the child. He didn't know how brave she'd gotten in the last couple of months, now that she had friends in Grace, Sarah, Sean, and maybe even Mr. Paxton downstairs, who was apparently ready to jump in if necessary. He might not jump in and save her himself, but he didn't seem to mind calling the authorities when things got out of line. Clearly, Richard didn't know that Lucy wasn't alone anymore, She wasn't an abandoned single mother desperate enough for a place for her and her child to sleep that she would barter with her body. She wasn't a scared little rabbit jumping at every raised voice and slammed door. And she wasn't a trained monkey who closed her eyes and did whatever she was told to do because she thought she owed anyone anything. Lucy wasn't so sure she herself knew or believed all those things about her yet, but if she kept telling herself so over and over, one day she would believe it. A few minutes later, with her mug of steaming red raspberry leaf and rosehip tea in hand, she made her way around the little apartment and turned off all but the bathroom nightlight for Itzy. Then she dropped into the easy chair with a deep sigh. It was the first full moon of the new year, and moonlight streamed in through the open window, illuminating the futon and the small misshapen lump Itzy made beneath the comforter. It splashed across the floor between the bed and Lucy's chair, casting a magical blue-gold hue over everything, making Lucy think of Neverland at night. She'd drawn back the curtains all the way. She wasn't worried about anyone seeing into their third-story apartment. Tonight, she wanted to see out. Outside her little world, outside herself, beyond what she'd been to what she could become, to the life she could provide for her babies and herself. Lucy shifted her hips in an effort to get comfortable. If Ollie hadn't dropped already, he was poised to do so, his head pressed against the ridge of her pubic bones, making her groin ache uncomfortably. She'd suffered from very little morning sickness with both pregnancies, had no health issues except that her doctor wanted her to gain more weight with this one, and her hair, skin, and nails looked amazing. But as much as she loved being pregnant, this last week she'd struggled more than she remembered with Itzy. And now, with Richard breathing down her neck, her discomfort was only exaggerated by being on edge. She stroked slow circles over her distended belly as she hummed softly, until her frazzled mind settled into the soothing lyrics of a plum lullaby. It was one of Itzy's favorites, and sure enough, the little girl shifted slightly in her sleep, the sweet smile still hovering at the corners of her mouth. Lucy's phone buzzed in the pocket of her cardigan, and she flinched, sloshing the hot tea a little. Should she just power the thing off altogether? But what if he actually did show up? The time it took to wait for her phone to come back on so she could call for help could be a matter of life or death. She pulled the phone out and set it to silence, switching the vibrate option off too. Then she slipped it back into her pocket. She decided that if Richard really knew where she was, he'd already be here. So for the moment, she was safely ensconced behind her dead-bolted apartment door, as well as the main door at the front entrance of Pemberton Manor that required an entry code to open. Right now, she needed to relax so she could climb in bed next to Itzy and not toss and turn all night. They both could use a good night's sleep. She needed to stop thinking about Richard, stop trying to figure out how the man in the apartment below her heard the things Richard had messaged to her. There had to be an explanation for it, right? And she needed to forget that Sean, an avid reader, a fact that still made Lucy shake her head in disbelief, might have figured out her secret identity in spite of her efforts to keep Ms. Violet in her closet. Tonight, she'd rest. Tomorrow, she'd deal. I will not bring this baby into the world all run down and stressed out, she reminded herself, speaking low and in a sing-song voice so as not to disturb Itzy. She lifted her tea mug to the grinning face of the moon. To new beginnings. Chapter 4. 4 hours later, Lucy awoke with a start, her eyes narrowed against the brilliant orb perched in the night sky outside her window. At first, She thought she'd fallen asleep with the light on. It was so bright. "Oh," she muttered groggily, remembering. "Hello, pretty moon." Then a rush of hot fluid between her legs brought everything into sharp focus in less than a second. It was too early, nearly 3 weeks too early. It wasn't time. She wasn't ready. But apparently, wee Oliver was. Lucy hoisted herself up, the wetness on her legs growing chilled in the night air. She pulled the comforter off the futon, first checking to make sure nothing had gotten on it, and fluffed it into a nest on the easy chair. She leaned over Itzy and murmured softly in her ear, "Baby, I need you to move to the chair for me, okay?" She didn't dare try to pick Itzy up. With eyes half closed, Itzy sat up and allowed her mother to direct her around the wet part of the mattress and across the floor, and then climbed clumsily into the mounded blanket. Lucy tucked the edges around her snugly. "Did I wet the bed, Mommy?" the little girl asked in her sleep-husky voice. "No, Itzy, I did." Itzy snickered, but her eyes stayed closed. "You're silly. Mommies don't wet the bed." Then she let out a long huff of air and tucked her hand under her cheek where it rested on the arm of the chair. A moment later, she was asleep again. Lucy hurried to the bathroom, stripped off her soaked nightgown, wiped down her legs with a warm washcloth, and pulled on her thick robe. She'd bought it for Richard, but he'd never worn it, had forgotten it was even in his closet, in fact, and she'd claimed it for herself. It was the only thing of his she'd brought with her, and only because he'd never worn it, and it was super soft and large enough to cover her belly. Technically, Ollie was Richard's too, although he'd taken to accusing her of cheating on him. "We always use protection," he insisted, even though they both knew that, more and more, the kind of sex they had made it difficult to be sure the protection was effective. "You owe me," he'd remind her if she resisted. "I took you and your kid in when no one else would." Richard had indeed taken her in when her parents had refused to let her move back home after Itzy's father Daniel had left her for another woman, claiming he wasn't ready to be a full-time dad. Her parents had offered to take Itzy, who was nearly 2, but not Lucy. "You chose the life you have," they never hesitated to remind her. When she'd gotten pregnant right after her 16th birthday, they'd given her 2 options. She could stay and give the baby to them to adopt and raise as Lucy's sibling, or she could leave and do whatever she wanted. They'd allowed her to stay until summer that year, hoping she'd change her mind. But Daniel graduated high school, got a job at a local grocery supermarket, and they moved in together, young and naive, in love and filled with bright dreams about the future. Itzy, born small and angry, became a wedge that drove them apart, because love wasn't enough when commitment wasn't part of the mix. When Daniel left, she'd sent her parents pictures, not as an apology, but because she needed to know her baby had somewhere to go if she could no longer take care of her. Rhonda and Carl Farnsworth wanted an apology. So Lucy started calling the few people she knew who might have a place she could stay temporarily until she figured out what she was going to do. She knew Richard through Daniel. Daniel drove a bread delivery truck, and they'd met through work. He'd been over a couple of times, had always been attentive to Lucy, but not noticeably inappropriate. When he'd offered her his spare bedroom, for as long as you need it, she'd been beyond grateful. In exchange, she'd do all the cooking and cleaning until she found a place of her own. But 2 weeks turned into a month, and then 2. And one night, after Itzy had fallen asleep on the futon they shared, and Lucy had turned out the lights and gone to bed, Richard had slipped in beside her, reminding her of all that he was doing for her, and asked ever so nicely if she'd do something for him. Desperate and running out of options, she'd consented with her silence, because she didn't want Itzy to wake up. In a state of numb acceptance, Lucy weighed things out and decided that staying was better than the unknown. She liked Richard well enough, all things considered, and he did provide her with room and board. There weren't fireworks between them, at least not at the beginning, but the first time she refused him, he wasn't happy, and Lucy knew her welcome was wearing thin. When she objected to Itzy sleeping on the couch so Richard could come and go from her bed as he liked, he threatened to kick them out. Lucy, a voracious reader who used to dream of being a novelist, heard about the quick rise of erotica romance, and after reading several of the top-selling books, she knew she'd found her means to escape. While Richard was gone to work, she got on his computer and learned everything she could about self-publishing. She saved her work online, clearing out the computer's history every time she got off, and within a year, she'd published the first 2 books of her series. She was good with words, and although some of the things she read and subsequently wrote both shocked and embarrassed her, she kept at it, not allowing herself to think too much about it, especially when her first royalty check showed up in the mailbox. It wasn't much, but it was the first money Lucy had ever made on her own, and she was giddy with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She still had her little 2-door Saturn she'd bought from a friend's dad in high school, and although Richard kept track of the miles she put on it, doling out just enough gas money for the grocery store and Walmart once a week, she stopped at a bank in between the two and set up a savings account so she could have her royalties directly deposited and not have to worry about Richard finding checks lying around. When she'd forget he'd requested spaghetti, not lasagna, for dinner, or Lever 2000 bar soap, not Irish Spring, once Itzy was asleep in the living room, he made sure she wouldn't forget again. And when she told him she was pregnant, he picked up a chair and threw it across the room. Itzy began to cry, and he threatened to shut her up if Lucy didn't. With her royalties, she bought a cheap laptop from Walmart, one she kept hidden behind the futon when Richard was home, and continued writing, publishing, and saving, terrified of what would happen if he found out, but more terrified of what would happen if she didn't get out. Chapter 5. As Lucy approached the futon, a contraction tightened in a wide band around her middle, and she took a deep breath in, held it, and released it slowly. She glanced at the clock on the end table, 1:28 in the morning. In spite of her water having broken, her contractions were more than 15 minutes apart. She had time. It didn't take Lucy long to pull the sheets from the futon. Providentially, because up until right around Christmas Itzy had indeed had trouble with bedwetting, Lucy always used a plastic pad under the sheets to protect the futon mattress. She leaned forward to fold it around the wet sheets, and stiffened. Another contraction began low at the base of her back. It hadn't even been 5 minutes since the last one, but it was short and not too painful. "Not bad," she muttered. "Not yet, anyway." She wondered if she should take the sheets downstairs to the laundry room on the first floor now, or if she could wait until morning so she wouldn't disturb anyone else in the building. Her labor with Itzy had taken hours, so it was likely, come daylight, she'd have plenty of time to wash the bedding and clean things up a little around the apartment. Right now, she needed to pack a hospital bag for herself and figure out what she was going to do with her little girl. Itzy had been born on her due date, so Lucy had expected Ollie to follow suit, and she'd made plans to have her daughter visit her grandparents the week the baby was due. Even though they didn't have much to say to Lucy, they loved spending whatever time she gave them with Itzy. As much as she hated to admit it, They were good to Itzy, never saying a negative word about Lucy that she was aware of, and always sending Itzy home with new sturdy clothing or shoes or educational toys like coloring sets and puzzles. She shoved the bundle of bedclothes into a laundry basket and scooted it toward the front door to wait for morning. After making certain Itzy was sound asleep, she headed to the shower. She was freezing. As she entered the bathroom, her stomach muscles tightened and bunched again, this time so hard she had to grab onto the doorframe to hold herself upright. It hurt so badly she forgot to breathe, and she bit down on her bottom lip to stifle the moan so Itzy wouldn't hear it. When it was over, leaving her wobbly kneed in the aftermath, she stepped out of the robe and into the shower, growing more anxious by the minute as 2 more contractions left her panting and trembling, her tears mingling with the hot water sluicing down her face. She finished up and dried off quickly, slipping into a pair of maternity leggings and a long tunic sweater that reached mid-thigh, pausing to lean against the bathroom counter as yet another contraction clamped down around her belly. "Itzy," she murmured, gently shaking the girl's shoulder, willing the desperation to stay out of her voice. "Honey, I need you to wake up and put on your jacket." Itzy wore warm, footed pajamas that zipped up to her neck. "We need to go to the hospital. Ollie wants... out." She breathed through another one. How was she going to drive if she was having a contraction every couple of minutes? Good thing it was the middle of the night, less traffic to avoid. She grabbed her purse and keys, along with a backpack of books and toys for Itzy. It was one she kept packed and ready for car rides or for emergencies like this, and held the door open for her daughter, who stumbled out into the hallway, half grumbling, half whimpering over the rude awakening. Another contraction. "Oh, please, Lucy moaned softly, fighting to maintain control as panic rose up in her. Itzy headed toward the elevator, and Lucy hesitated only for a split second. If she weren't so shaky, she'd take the stairs. With her luck, the Otis would get stuck between floors again, and she'd deliver Ollie with only the bleary-eyed Itzy as witness. "You'd better not fail me tonight, Pemberton Manor," she growled, low and hoarse as she nodded permission at her daughter. Itzy pushed the down button. They heard the mechanism behind the safety door grind into action, letting them know the elevator was on its way. And they waited. And waited. Lucy reached over Itzy's head and pushed the button. "Please, she panted. Itzy sank to the floor and leaned her back against the wall, cupping her cheeks in her hands. "No, baby, stand up, don't fall asleep. I need you to be ready as soon as it gets here," Lucy said. Itzy whined wordlessly, but did as she was told. Still, they waited. The gears inside the shaft ground away, and Lucy pressed on the button again, certain the lift would arrive on their floor at any moment. Surely no one else in the building was even awake, no less using the elevator at this hour. When another contraction gripped Lucy in a vice that made it hard to breathe, she couldn't hold back her tears. "Come on, baby," she whimpered, pulling Itzy toward the stairs. "We can't wait any longer." How on earth she was going to traverse 3 flights of stairs was beyond her, but she couldn't stand outside the Otis all night waiting for an elevator that wasn't going to show. Itzy didn't even argue. She suddenly seemed more aware of just how dire things were for her mother. Holding on to the railing with both hands, Lucy made her way down the stairs sideways, slowly, carefully, feeling the jolt of each step in every cell of her body. She made Itzy descend behind her just in case her legs went out. God forbid she should fall on her little girl. "Are you okay, Mommy?" Itzy's tiny voice reverberated obnoxiously in the stairwell. She was more alert now. Itzy cared as little for the stairwell as Lucy did for the Otis. I will be, I promise. We just need to get to the car and then we'll drive to the hospital so a doctor can help me have Ollie, okay? She reached over and smoothed a few unruly curls from the girl's face. You're a big girl, Itzy. I'm glad you're here with me, keeping me company, helping me to be brave, she added between short, gasping breaths. I'm very brave, Itzy said, even though her voice trembled noticeably. I will be brave for both of us, okay? 3 steps from the second-floor landing, Lucy's knees buckled, and she went down hard, crying out at the pain that jolted up her spine from her tailbone. The contraction that followed was so intense, she couldn't tell where it ended and her back pain started. Mommy, are you okay? Itzy cried out, her voice not so tiny anymore, fear making it harsh and high-pitched, loud. I'm okay, baby, Lucy gasped after what seemed like forever, relieved to finally feel the muscles loosening around her middle. Oh, Lord, help me. With both hands gripping the rail above her, she tried to pull herself upright, but a pain like a dagger stabbed through her back, and she gasped, unable to catch her breath. Tiny lights flickered in her peripheral vision, and she thought she was going to be sick. Mommy! Itzy wailed again, crouching down beside Lucy, her cold hands cupping her mother's cheeks. Mommy, please don't be hurt. It's okay, baby. It's okay, Lucy whimpered, tears of frustration and pain coursing down her face. Just let Mommy rest a minute, okay? Itzy huddled on the step beside her, crying silently now too. When she could think clearly, Lucy put her arm around her little girl and pulled her close to her side. Itzy, honey, I need you to be very brave for me, okay? Yes, Mommy? I need you to go back upstairs and knock on Sarah's door. She panted as another wave of pain wrapped tentacles around her body. She could no longer differentiate between the back spasms and contractions. Bang on it very hard and call her name. Don't stop until she answers. Do you think you can do that? Itzy was nodding before Lucy finished. I'll get Sarah. She'll help you, Mommy. Thank you, baby, Lucy whispered, closing her eyes so Itzy wouldn't see the misery in them. Hurry, Itzy. But when Itzy reached the door at the top of the stairs, it wouldn't budge. The little girl pulled down on the release handle. Lucy heard the click of the latch disengaging, but either Itzy was too weak to pull the door open, or it was stuck closed. Mommy, I can't, she wailed, weeping openly now. I can't open the door. I'm sorry, Mommy. Lucy moaned and panted hard into another wave of pain, and Itzy hurried back down the stairs and hovered at her side, as though afraid to touch her. Lucy took Itzy's hand, mindful not to squeeze it as she held on. It's okay, baby. They were only a few feet from the door to the second floor. Maybe she could make it that far. She let go of Itzy's hand and braced hers on either side of her hips. You need to grab your backpack for me, okay? We're going to see if we can get some help on this floor. She jutted her chin toward the door in front of her. Maybe August's daddy is home. But the moment she pushed up, her back spasmed, and she cried out sharply. Itzy did too. What were they going to do? She couldn't send Itzy out into the hall to start knocking on strangers' doors, could she? She hadn't spoken to August since Christmas and had no idea who his father was, if he was a nice man or not. She knew nothing of Mr. Paxton in the apartment below her, except that he'd been decent enough to have Sean check on her when he thought there were some questionable shenanigans going on above him. But he might not appreciate a laboring woman and her scared little girl showing up on his doorstep in the middle of the night, weeping incoherently. There was another apartment on the second floor, 2B, but Lucy had no clue who lived in that one. "Let me think, baby. Just sit here beside me," she whispered, patting the step next to her. "It's okay. We'll figure something out. Breathe, Lucy. In through the nose, long and slow. Hold it. 1, 2, 3. Out through the mouth, long and slow. Repeat and repeat." A noise, like someone pounding on a door in the hall above them, startled Lucy, and Itzy let out a tiny squawk. "Shh, baby," Lucy whispered, pulling Itzy's face into her chest, acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. Because in her gut, she knew it was Richard. He'd said he knew where she was. He'd said he was coming for her. And now, he was here. She knew it like she knew the color of her daughter's eyes. The pounding continued a few more moments, then a crash followed by a loud thunk, like the slamming of a door, and then there was silence. Lucy waited, praying, begging her body to cooperate, for Ollie to wait just a little longer, for her back to stop twitching and jerking. She kept Itzy's head pressed to her chest, and when Richard's face appeared in the glass panel of the third-floor stairwell door, she didn't even flinch at the terrifying image. She just prayed harder. He rattled and shook the door, banging on the glass panel so hard Lucy thought it might break, and Itzy shrieked, her tiny arms snaking around her mother's neck in terror. Lucy felt a warm wetness soak into the backs of her thighs. Itzy had peed herself. Chapter 6. The door didn't open. No matter how hard he pounded and shoved, no matter how loudly Richard cursed, the door stayed closed. Lucy took several deep, fortifying breaths, and then lurched to her feet, hauled Itzy up over her distended stomach, and with a strength and will that only a desperate mother could conjure up, she staggered down the last steps, her legs trembling beneath her, leaving the backpack and her purse behind. Just as she reached the landing, the door in front of her flew open, and a huge man surged into the stairwell. He caught her and Itzy before she collapsed, scooped them both up into his arms, and carried them out of the stairwell and across the hall and to the door of an apartment on the second floor. For a moment, Lucy thought she was going to pass out. She could feel the weight of Itzy like a spider monkey clinging to her chest, but she was being carried, held like a child, high against her father's chest. She could hear the steady beat of his heart where her ear rested against him, just like when she'd been a little girl and had fallen asleep on the couch, and he'd carried her, all soft and floppy and content, to her bed. "I love you, Daddy," she murmured, the past mingling so vividly with the present that for a moment Lucy wasn't sure she'd said the words out loud. "I got you," said a gruff voice that was decidedly not her father's. "The police are on the way." Lucy opened her eyes and peered up into the battered and scarred face of her rescuer. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed and grateful at the same time. "I'm sorry we woke you." "Shh," he rasped out, the sound harsh but not unkind. White puckered ridges laced his throat, and part of his left ear was missing. His left eye drooped at the corner, but he met her gaze boldly. "It's all right. Let's get you inside." It seemed to Lucy like talking might be difficult for him. Was it because he was carrying them, or because of his injuries? Lucy closed her eyes again, her back spasms mingling once again with another contraction. Tears spilled from the corners of her eyes as she breathed through the pain, focusing all her attention on staying conscious and holding on to Itzy so that her rescuer, was this old Mr. Paxton from the apartment below her, wouldn't drop them both. A few moments later, he carefully lowered her to a neatly made bed. "We're wet," she breathed out. "We had an accident." Itzy still held tightly to her neck, her face pressed into the curve of her shoulder. Lucy wondered if the little girl even knew what was happening, or if she'd simply shut down. She hadn't changed positions since Lucy had picked her up in the stairwell. "It's all right," the man said again. "Lie still." Lucy had to resist the urge to cringe at the rasp of his voice, like stones in a rock crusher. "Are you in labor?" "Yes," she gasped, trying in vain to pry Itzy off her chest. "And I hurt my back, my tailbone." The man pulled his cell phone from a back pocket and dialed emergency services. She looked away when she saw the scars webbing the back of his left hand. In as few words as possible, he told the dispatcher he'd already alerted the police, but that an ambulance was needed too. "How close are your contractions?" he asked, his eyes narrowed with concern, his expression gentle in spite of the destruction to his features. "I'm not sure." She hadn't stopped to time them since before getting in the shower. "Less than 5 minutes apart, though." As if on cue, another one had her drawing her knees up, a moan escaping as she pressed her mouth to Itzy's hair. 3 minutes, the man said into the phone. Apparently he was timing them now. Good. "Baby, I need you to lie beside me now, okay?" she murmured between panting breaths. "We're safe. Safe, baby. Please." Itzy slowly lifted her head and slid to one side, but her hand still clutched Lucy's sweater sleeve, her eyes wide and wild with fear. "It's okay, Itzy. You just hold on to my top. I won't let you go," Lucy said, when the contraction began to ease up a little. She lifted her gaze to the man who'd rescued them, but he'd turned his back, his phone still pressed to his ear, responding to whatever was being said to him in clipped, brief answers. She studied him while his back was turned. He was intimidatingly large, his torso broad, the sweatshirt he wore stretched tightly from shoulder to shoulder. He had to be at least a foot taller than Lucy, and he probably weighed twice as much as she did even at 8.5 months pregnant. He wore loose martial arts-style pants, but she could still tell his legs were long and thickly muscled. No wonder he'd carried them so effortlessly. She wondered offhandedly if she should be afraid, but the thought flickered out of existence a moment later. What had happened to him to cause the extensive scarring? A fire? An explosion of some kind? A car accident like August's? A moment later, he hung up, shoved the phone in his back pocket again, and turned in a way that made only the right side of his face clearly visible to them. From that angle, Lucy could see the ruggedly handsome man he was beneath the scars. Prominent brow accenting deep-set eyes, high cheekbones, a slightly crooked nose, and a full jaw. His hair had been brown once, but now streaks of silver wove through it. He let her study him for a few moments, and then he spoke, slowly, painstakingly, as though every word took great effort. "The police are here. They'll take care of the intruder. The ambulance is on its way." He took a deep breath, his chest expanded noticeably, as though preparing himself for something, it seemed to Lucy, and then continued. "I'm Paxton. Pax Thayer. Please don't be frightened. I won't hurt you." He turned to face them full on. Lucy's heart skittered momentarily in her chest. Itzy didn't make a sound, but Lucy could feel her whole body tense beside her on the bed. Before she could say anything, what did one say in a situation like this? Paxton continued in his rough voice. "How can I help you?" A shudder swept through Lucy, one of relief this time, not pain, and overwhelmed by gratitude, she had to swallow hard so she could speak past the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Paxton. You've done so much more than anyone." But she thought of Sean, who had befriended her and Itzy in spite of her standoffish manners, and of Grace and Sarah, who also went out of their way to look out for her and Itzy, to be kind to them. "Sarah!" she exclaimed. "Oh no! Is she okay?" Lucy thought of Richard up on the 3rd floor banging on doors, and of tender, trusting Sarah naively opening her door to that monster. Paxton held up his hand. "The police have him. She's safe." He patted his back pocket where he'd shoved his phone. "Police assured me all is under control." He glanced at a black-faced watch on his right wrist. "Paramedics will be here soon." There was a knock on the door, and Paxton cocked his head, his brows furrowed slightly. That was fast. Then he hurried from the room. But when he returned, it was with a police officer carrying Lucy's purse and Itzy's backpack they'd left behind in the stairwell, and Sarah Winters, dressed in yoga pants and a bulky sweatshirt, emblazoned with an embroidered unicorn across the front of it, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail on top of her head. She hurried over to the bed, dropped to her knees beside them, and laid one hand on Lucy's shoulder and one on Itzy's head. "Hey, you two," she said, her voice refreshingly calm, her touch gentle, soothing. "The cops told me you two were safe here with Paxton, and that you, dear Lucy, were in labor, so I made them bring me along." She narrowed her eyes at Lucy. "I'm going with you to the hospital, just so you know." Lucy felt a grin tug at the corner of her mouth. "You're as bossy as a first-grade teacher," she ground out, as another contraction tightened around her. "Yep," Sarah agreed, her own smile warm. "And I told them they could just wait to talk to you about—" She broke off and glanced at Itzy, quickly assessing things before continuing. "They can talk to you after Ollie shows up. First things first." She glanced over her shoulder to the man in uniform who stood beside Paxton, where the two spoke with low tones, their heads bent close together. "Right, officer?" "Right," he said agreeably. "Baby first. Talk later." Sarah tipped her head at Itzy. "Hey, Sugar Puff. Do you want to change out of those pajamas since we're going to the hospital?" She said nothing about the child wetting herself, and Lucy was unspeakably grateful for Sarah's sensitivity toward Itzy. "Do you maybe have a change of clothes in your backpack?" Sarah asked, waving a hand at the police officer. He stepped forward and handed her both bags. "There should be a shirt and leggings," Lucy panted. "Clean undies." "Well then, come here, kiddo," Sarah said to Itzy, holding a hand out to her. "Let's get you dressed quickly so you can come back and take care of your mommy like the big girl you are." She shot a look at Paxton. "Can we use your bathroom, kind sir?" Paxton stepped aside to let Sarah and Itzy pass. "On the right," he directed. "Stay with Lucy until I get back," Sarah instructed. "And don't let Officer Banner interrogate her while I'm gone, you hear?" Paxton nodded again, but said nothing. He seemed perfectly at ease in the middle of the chaos of the scene, so Lucy stopped worrying about him or the hovering Officer Banner and closed her eyes to concentrate on breathing. Chapter 7. On Monday afternoon, when the last of her first-grade students had been picked up for the day, Sarah stopped by the hospital to collect Lucy and baby Oliver and bring them home to Pemberton Manor. Over the weekend, Sean had brought in a repairman to fix the broken apartment door, and the two sisters and Itzy had cleaned and decorated 3C to welcome Lucy and Ollie home. Grace, having taken Monday morning off work, and Itzy baked yummy cupcakes with pretty blue frosting and sprinkles to celebrate the homecoming. The fridge and freezer were stocked with enough meals to last at least a couple of weeks, courtesy of Mrs. Winters and her Heaven's Helpers group from their church. They'd also sent over several bags of boy clothes, various sizes of disposable diapers, and a huge plastic bin of baby paraphernalia like diaper rash ointment, nail clippers, baby wash, pacifiers, and so much more. Lucy's heart was near to bursting with love for these new friends, some she'd never even met, who were more family to her than her own. She was so proud of her brave little Itsy, and grateful beyond measure for the tiny bundle of boy who'd been born squalling and red-faced, just as his big sister had 5 years earlier. Itsy, who'd been too excited to sleep well the night before, passed out on the futon with her head on Lucy's lap, while Sarah and Grace took turns adoring Ollie. Sarah handed the baby off to a very impatient Grace, and then turned to Lucy, her expression serious. "Have the police talked to you yet?" she asked directly. Over the last several weeks, Lucy had gotten accustomed to Sarah's no-nonsense mannerisms, so she wasn't exactly surprised by her neighbor's bluntness. "They did. They stopped by last night. It was all very proper and they were quick. Apparently they didn't even need my statement to book him, because the owners charged him with breaking and entering. I guess he messed up both my door and the front door pretty badly." She shook her head, still a little taken aback by how out of control Richard had gotten, and even further, in hindsight, by how quickly he'd gone from helpful friend in her time of need to abusive partner once she was under his roof. It scared her to think that she might not be able to recognize someone with propensities toward violence, but the thought only strengthened her resolve to steer clear of any kind of relationship with any man that wasn't purely platonic. Sarah shook her head. "I hate stuff like this, Lucy. As a teacher, I see it too often. It usually starts with a mother falling down the stairs or some other excuse for an injury." She made quotation marks in the air with her fingers. "But inevitably, when there are kids, they end up getting hurt too." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Don't let this guy get away with anything. We'll be here for you, okay? You're not alone." Lucy nodded, blinking away unshed tears. "Thank you." "Pemberton Manor is a good place," Sarah declared. "A safe place. It's home to a lot of good people, and we will all bend over backward to keep it that way." "Sean called this a safe place too," Lucy said, remembering his words from Friday night. "I love Pemberton Manor," Grace interjected. "I'm waiting for my sister to invite me to live with her because I'm too scared to live alone." She nudged Sarah with her knee. "I still live with Mom and Dad." She rolled her eyes at her own insecurity. "I mean, sounds like I'd be safe here, you think?" "You can have my place when Pete and I get married." Grace snorted at Sarah's response. "Like that's ever going to happen." "Fine, then you can't have it. I'll pass it on to someone who deserves it," Sarah said, reaching out to stroke the baby's cheek. Ollie's mouth fell open, and he turned slightly toward her touch. A tingling rush flooded Lucy's swollen breasts as her milk let down. Her fingertips buzzed slightly, and her arms ached for Ollie as she gazed at him, cradled in Grace's embrace. It was all she could do not to ask for her baby back, to press his tiny body close to her heart, to kiss his perfect little face, to tell him how much she already loved him. But she forced her thoughts back to the subject at hand. Richard Spencer, not Sarah and Pete and their pending or not nuptials, a topic Lucy already knew was a little tender for Sarah. "I'd already planned on pressing charges anyway." She stroked the soft curls on Itzy's head, marveling at how big her daughter now seemed compared to Ollie. "There's no way I'd ever let that man get his hands on my babies," she went on quietly, but with grave resolution. "I told the police officer everything I could think of. I have a doctor's visit documenting evidence of his abuse, even though at the time I was too afraid to press charges. I was told there are assault charges against him from another woman, too, so it's not just me now." "Good," Sarah said. She and Grace both nodded approvingly. The more they can find who will stand against him, the longer he'll be off the streets. And Paxton downstairs heard him threaten me repeatedly, she added, not sure how to explain that mystery to herself, let alone to anyone else. So he's agreed to be a witness. Good. He knows what he's doing. Sarah started, but Grace spoke at the same time, unintentionally cutting her off. What actually happened here? She asked in a hushed voice, her eyes wide with questions. I mean, if you don't mind me asking, that is. Lucy shook her head slowly, wondering how much she could tell these sisters without sounding crazy. She had yet to talk to Paxton about his part in the ordeal. He'd promised to come visit after she got home and settled again, so she'd have a chance soon if she was brave enough to ask. It was both unsettling and providential, the way he'd been able to hear her phone messages. She couldn't figure out how he'd done it, but she didn't want to even imagine what might have happened if Paxton hadn't heard anything, hadn't been on the alert already when Richard actually did show up. On the other hand, having gotten stuck in the Otis with Grace and August on Christmas Eve in another somewhat inexplicable situation, the elevator had worked perfectly at the end of the night, as though nothing was wrong with it. Lucy decided that Grace, of all people, might understand what she was about to say. It was the strangest thing, she began slowly. As worried as I was about getting stuck, we intended to use the elevator because by the time I got out to the hall, I didn't think I'd make it down the stairs. I wondered what you were doing taking the stairs, Sarah quipped, reaching for another blue-topped cupcake. She turned to her sister. These are bomb, Gracie. Grace grinned. Secret recipe. You can't have it. Lucy smiled at the constant bantering between the sisters. It made her long for a sibling of her own, and pleased her to no end that Itzy would have a brother to play with, even if he was several years younger. Sorry for interrupting, Sarah apologized, her blue-tinted teeth flashing from her sheepish smile. Go on. Lucy waved away her apology and continued. So this is going to sound insane, but hear me out, okay? Both sisters nodded, anticipation gleaming in their eyes. I think maybe there's something special about that elevator, you know? Or maybe it's the whole place. Lucy's gaze darted back and forth between them, coming to land on the younger of the two. When we got stuck last month, Grace, remember how easily the elevator door opened after we'd gotten to know each other? Lucy snorted derisively, her words sounding even more ridiculous than she'd thought they might. I'm not crazy, you guys, but it was like the Otis... Well... She broke off and blew out a huff of frustration. Like it wanted us stuck in there together, Grace finished for her, studying her over the top of Ollie's head. I know what you mean. I've thought the same thing all along, she admitted sagely. I mean, I don't think any of us really wanted to be in there. Except Itzy, of course. I know I was just in a mad rush to get upstairs because I was running late. I figured I'd zip up, fall out into the third-floor hall with all my stuff, and disappear inside Sarah's place. Never had any intention of sharing a meal with some of my new favorite people. Right, Lucy agreed, feeling much better about the direction of her thoughts. She shifted slightly on the cushion beneath her, one they'd sent her home with to help protect her re-injured tailbone. Well, the other night, when we left the apartment, something strange happened. We got to the elevator, Itzy pushed the button, and we heard the Otis coming up the shaft. Her brow furrowed as she thought back to the incident. We have ridden that dumb thing so many times, right? So I know how long it takes to come up to the third floor, even if it has to make stops along the way. She glanced over at Sarah, who was meticulously peeling back the polka-dotted paper wrapper around the cupcake. She'd licked the icing clean already. But she said nothing, and Lucy continued. So we waited, and waited, and waited. Then I pushed the button several more times, and even though we could hear it, like it would come to a stop at our floor at any second, it just never happened. So finally, out of desperation, we took the stairs. Lucy shuddered as the rest of the scene played out in her mind. You don't have to tell us if you don't want to, Grace said, repositioning Ollie closer to her face so she could smell his head. It's okay, Lucy said. It's kind of cathartic, you know? But she took her time, carefully choosing her words. When I fell on the stairs, I couldn't get back up. My tailbone hurt so badly. So I finally sent Itzy to come get you, Sarah. Sarah cocked her head and looked aghast. You did? Did I just not hear her? No, that's not it. Lucy waved a hand to reassure her. The stairwell door wouldn't open for her. She practically hung on the handle to release it, and I heard it click open. I might have been in excruciating pain, but I heard it. For whatever reason, no matter how hard she tried, she could not open that door for anything. It's kinda heavy, Grace reasoned. Maybe she was freaking out a little? I know I would be. Lucy shook her head, bemused all over again. She's opened that door many times before, you guys. It was like someone, or something, was holding it closed, keeping us in the stairwell. She hesitated, and then added, keeping us safe from... She couldn't quite get the words out. When that animal tried to get to us, the door wouldn't open for him either. There isn't any kind of automatic lock on those doors, Sarah confirmed softly. The only way to lock them is by deadbolt. And because the stairwell is the fire escape, it's illegal to do so. I know, Lucy said just as quietly. But the police officers? They had no problem with the door. None. Whoa, Grace said, in a long, drawn-out breath. I just got major chills. Sarah turned narrowed eyes on Grace, but she didn't say anything to the contrary, so after another brief hesitation, Lucy stated, Like you said, Sarah, this house is safe, whether it's because the people living here look after each other, or because the house itself does. Or both, Grace added, her eyes wide with wonder. Or both, Lucy agreed. Pemberton Manor is a good place, and I'm really glad we're here. After a weighty pause, Sarah nodded. We're glad you're here, too. She reached over and ran the tip of her finger along the curve of Ollie's little ear. The baby's eyelids fluttered open, and the women cooed appreciatively. All three of you, Grace agreed, and then, as if reading the unguarded longing in Lucy's eyes, she held Ollie out to her. Here you go, Mama. He's perfect, and I love him. Lucy couldn't agree more. Sarah pushed up from her cross-legged position on the floor. She picked up the plate of cupcakes and offered it to Grace, who selected one with lots of icing. She offered Lucy a cupcake too, which she turned down. Then Sarah took a deep breath and changed the subject. Well, that Paxton Thayer is something else, isn't he? Lucy nodded, her eyes on her baby's precious face, one of her hands still resting on Itzy's head. Every time she thought of Paxton, something in her chest tightened. If not for him. Yes, he is, she said, her voice low and sure. A real hero in my book. Ollie was beginning to root around against her, making tiny smacking noises with his lips. She shifted Itzy a little so that she could lift the hem of her shirt to nurse. She'd always loved breastfeeding. It came easily to her, just as much of motherhood seemed to. Ollie had latched on immediately without any trouble, as had Itzy all those years ago. Lucy tucked her shirt close to her baby's face so as not to make the Winters sisters uncomfortable, but they both seemed to take it all in stride. "I can't wait to meet him," Grace said, licking the blue frosting off the top of the cupcake like she was eating an ice cream cone. Lucy needed to thank him for rescuing her, for not turning a blind eye or a deaf ear, for caring enough to step into the path of a stranger and offer a helping hand, even in the middle of the night. Her curiosity getting the best of her, she cleared her throat and asked, "Do you know anything about him, Sarah? About his— were they burns? She wasn't sure. About his condition?" Sarah carried the plate of remaining cupcakes to the kitchen and filled the old yellow tea kettle with water. "I'm going to make some tea, is that all right?" But she didn't wait for Lucy to answer, just set it on the stovetop and turned on the burner. "I don't know a whole lot, because he's a pretty private guy. He tends to keep to himself around here, but then a lot of the residents do. As much as we pay attention to what's going on, there isn't a lot of interaction, especially between floors." Sarah frowned as though fully realizing this for the first time. "I can understand that, though," Grace said. "I know it can be hard for people who don't feel like they're normal to go out and mingle with the masses." She smiled softly, almost to herself. "August struggles with that a lot." Lucy was glad to hear August Jones's name on Grace's lips. She'd been almost afraid to ask about him, and was waiting and hoping that Grace would bring him up. At least she knew they were still in touch. "Yeah, I'm sure that's a big part of it," Sarah agreed. "Paxton is pretty straightforward about his injuries. He seems like the kind of guy who would much rather you ask than pretend they don't exist." Lucy recalled how careful he'd been with her and Itzy, how he'd turned his back to them on several occasions, and then took his time revealing the extent of his scars so as not to startle them. He hadn't tried to hide his injuries, but had made the effort to not shock them. It saddened her, for his sake, that he had to take those measures when first meeting people, but she appreciated him all the more for his courage and sensitivity to others, when it should have been the other way around. Sarah snorted, and one side of her mouth lifted in a sardonic expression. "Of course, I've been known to cross the line when it comes to people's personal space, so it's possible he felt obligated to tell me because I flat out asked." "Sounds about right," Grace teased. "So why don't you spare Lucy the trouble and just tell us about his injuries then?" Sarah didn't even hesitate. "Well, he's an ex-cop. I don't know much of the details, but a few years ago he was out on a drug bust or a raid or something, and a meth lab blew up and burned his whole left side, especially his face and neck. His vocal cords were severely damaged, which makes it difficult for him to say more than a few words at a time. His voice is rough, but it's getting better. It's really a miracle that he's even alive, from what I've heard. I know he's fought long and hard to be where he's at today. I think he's still undergoing different treatments and therapies that are helping him. He's definitely come a long way since I moved in here several years ago." "Oh, wow," Lucy murmured sympathetically. "That's terrible." She pictured the puckered skin of his neck, the scarring on his cheek that pulled his left eye down, the partially missing ear, and what she'd seen of his hand and wrist. "Wow," she reiterated, feeling like she understood her rescuer a little better now. "I'm so glad he's okay." "You blow my mind, Sarah," Grace said, peeling away her cupcake's paper wrapper exactly the way Sarah had with her own a few minutes earlier. "The things you know about people in this building." She wiggled a crumb-tipped finger at her sister. "I can't decide if that makes you a super nosy neighbor or a super awesome neighbor." "Only the most super awesome neighbor on the block," Sarah declared, and then took a flamboyant bow. Grace wiggled her finger at Lucy next. Well, your Mr. Paxton Thayer sounds amazing. Sweeping you and Itzy up into his arms like that? Yowza! She flopped back in the chair. No one will ever sweep me up into his arms, she lamented, gesturing with both hands at her stately 6-foot frame and all her gorgeous womanly curves. I'd crush anyone who tried. Recovering quickly, she grinned at Lucy, her eyes twinkling. So, how old is he? Is he yummy? Lucy felt her cheeks grow warm, and she tried to laugh it off. I was a little distracted, she said in her own defense. So I'm not sure I'm the best judge of whether or not he was yummy. But an image of his wide shoulders, his muscular build, his long legs, drifted through her thoughts, and the solid warmth of him as he held her and Itzy high against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder, reminding her of her father. Oh, dear, she muttered softly, the heat returning to her cheeks, her neck, her chest. And then, without warning, she began to giggle, and Ollie popped off her breast, opened his deep gray eyes, and seemed to peer up at her, his little brow furrowed, which made her laugh even harder. Itzy stirred in her lap, and Lucy covered her mouth in an effort to hold it in. What? Asked Grace. What's so funny? She too was smiling, Lucy's laughter contagious. I said, I love you, Daddy, to Paxton, Lucy gasped, and then tipped her head back and laughed out loud. When she gathered her composure, she pulled her shirt down and propped Ollie against her shoulder, patting him firmly on the back as she explained what had happened. That is priceless, Sarah exclaimed in appreciation. I'm calling him Big Daddy when I meet him, Grace chortled, and I won't tell him why either, but I'll laugh every time I do. Geez Louise, I'd completely forgotten about that, Lucy said, shaking her head, too tired and giddy to be embarrassed at the moment. I really, really hope he's forgotten too. Poor guy. How am I going to even look at him when I see him again? There was a knock on the door, and Lucy's eyes grew round. What if that's him, you guys? Sarah cackled gleefully and crossed to the door to open it. It was only Sean, much to Lucy's relief. He came loaded with an armful of books and a bouquet of flowers. I come bearing gifts, he declared, his voice loud enough to make Ollie startle, but Itzy was clearly exhausted from the eventful weekend, because she was still once again, her breathing slow and peaceful. Shush! Sarah put a finger to her lips, then gestured at the sleeping girl. Sorry, dude. So, Sean continued in a voice that was not that much quieter, I brought you a buttload of books. I figured you'd need some convalescing material, yeah? He set the stack on the turquoise coffee table in front of Lucy. She spotted a couple of authors she liked and several names she didn't recognize in the stack, and she felt the familiar yearning to run her fingers over the bindings, to breathe in the smell of the printed pages. As though reading her mind, Sean said, You can look through those on your own time. Don't feel obligated to read them all. I just brought a variety, something for every mood, because, postpartum hormones and all. What do you know about postpartum hormones, Sean? Sarah asked from where she stood at the kitchen counter, compiling the ingredients for a pot of tea. I read, okay? He waved a hand at the books. And since the ladies appreciate me being in touch with my feminine side, I pay attention to those things. Thank you, Sean, Lucy said with a grateful smile. He was turning out to be quite a guy. And the flowers are beautiful. Aw, dude, nah, the flowers aren't from me. But he held them out for Lucy to take. So much for being in touch with your feminine side, Grace quipped, but her tone was gentle, teasing, and Sean shot her a good-natured grin. Lucy buried her nose in the colorful collection of pink roses, blue delphiniums, and white chrysanthemums among the greenery. Who are they from? Those are from old Pax. He's out for the week, but wanted to make sure you got them as soon as you made it home. Said he'd come see you in a couple of days, maybe Saturday afternoon, if that was okay with you." Old Pax. The way Sean talked about the guy, she'd assumed he was a crabby old codger who didn't like to be bothered by any noise from his upstairs neighbor. But Paxton Thayer wasn't as old as all that, at least not to Lucy, nor did he seem crabby or easily bothered. In fact, Paxton Thayer seemed like just the kind of person Lucy wanted for a neighbor, someone who understood the value of life and how easily it could be stripped away, someone who knew what it meant to fight for what was good and worthy, someone who knew firsthand the reality of having to choose to rise above the odds against him. If it was a miracle that Paxton was even alive, as Sarah had said, then was it really so unbelievable that he'd somehow miraculously heard Richard's threatening messages to her, that he'd somehow sensed the imminent danger she was in on Friday night, that he had acted on that knowledge? Paxton had saved the lives of her and her children, and although she knew that she was truly indebted to him, in fact to Sarah, Grace, and Sean too, she also knew with utter certainty that not one of them would ever say the words, "You owe me," to her. And so, she would offer what she could to each of her new neighbors at Pemberton Manor, her friendship, her loyalty, and her deep appreciation, not because she owed anyone, but because she wanted to. We hope you have enjoyed this production of The Moon Mother, Pemberton Manor, Book 2, written and narrated by Becky Doughty. Copyright 2017 by Becky Doughty. Production copyright 2022 by Becky Doughty. This is a Brave Hearts Press audio production. Thank you for listening.